Welcome to the Anno Court Equalized Group 3, our final presentation, I believe, for the year. Don't forget we have the closing banquet. You'll hear more about that later in this session, I believe. But let me take a few minutes before we go any further to thank the Daily Oklahoman for hosting our group. This is a really cool venue. And Clyde Bunyan, thank you so much for working with our group and allowing us to be here.
Yeah.
Before we get started with the presentation, I would like to introduce Clyde Bunyan, and she has a few words for us tonight.
I just wanted to welcome you all to the Oklahoman. I don't know if all of you have been here before, but if you haven't, as you can see, we have this is our new home. We've been here about 13 months and just loving being downtown. When Elizabeth reached out to us about hosting this event, I just jumped at it. We weren't sure whether we'd be large enough to accommodate you. As you can see, we don't have the vast spaces as we had across town anymore. But for the topic, I thought it was really, really important that we hosted here. There's no way I would let the law and media be held somewhere else. So I've heard that you all are creatures of habit, set in your ways, and this may be too tight a space. So if you're rubbing elbows with your neighbor, don't blame Elizabeth or Sonia, you can blame me. I really, really appreciate working with them to host this, and because I wanted one of our guys to be part of this discussion as well. So thanks for working with us, and I'll just put in a plug for my guys while I'm here. Reporters all the time are looking for expert advice from sources. And one of the things my guys have told me is that lawyers don't like to talk about things that doesn't necessarily relate to their cases. Well, guys, we're always looking for expert advice. And even if you have to talk to our guys on the background about something, we really, really would appreciate it if when they, particularly my business guys, Nolan, of course, and his team, they're expert on the criminal side, typically. But on the business side, when you get a call from a business reporter, please listen to him and respond. And if you can't speak specifically on a case, that'd be great to give some kind of background information or something general. Anyway, that's my spill. Thanks for coming again, and welcome to the Oklahoma.
I'll try not to belabor this because it's an interesting presentation tonight. It's kind of a hybrid of several ideas that came together last January when the students and some of the pupillage members were sitting around the table trying to figure out something new and fresh to do for the Hallway Anno Court. And being the old fogey that I am, and I teach a cinema class at UCO, I teach the political film, and I have no imagination. And I thought, well, let's do the old tried and true legal film. We've all done it before, it's deja vu. We've all been to many CLEs and other classes where we get to sit around and watch the great old legal films or excerpts of the great legal films and things like that and talk about them. And the students had this glaze in their eyes, like, can we do something different than that? And first I was a little offended, and then I thought of it. Give me an idea. Like, what are you talking about? Well, have you seen Making of a Murderer? And I said, what? Have you seen Making of a Murderer, or some of the different law and order programs that are running today? Some of the different legal, come on, Brown. You don't have to sit around and watch 1932's John Barrymore in Criminal Lawyer all the time. There are other things going on in the world today, and they were telling me about Making of a Murderer. We've got, for the last 20 or so years, a lot of us have probably experienced with our jurors a new sophistication. Jurors are suddenly wanting more from our trial presentations. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? On television, I saw them do that, especially those of you that practice criminal law. and they're rather disappointed in our lane presentations, right? And their expectations are high. They're sophisticated, they're knowledgeable, and they want to see a lot more. And with reality-based television and film, there's a greater expectation. And our OCU students started telling me about Making of a Murderer, and Margot and I were finally able to catch several episodes of it, and it was fascinating. There is a whole new genre of legal film out there, and anybody my age or thereabouts should give it a try. It's fascinating, because you're going to understand why the old classic legal film that I teach may not work as well as we think it did at one time. Now, if you're still starved for those great old legal films, you can hit Google and come up with a wonderful list of titles of those, Witness for the Prosecution or Judgment at Nuremberg. There are many, many books available on Amazon. Here's Movies on Trial. Here's Real Justice, which we kind of stole our title of the presentation from, but there are lots and lots of great books on the classic legal films. So don't feel like you're being left out tonight. They're still there. But tonight we wanted to try something a little different. And one of the things we wanted to do is explore and discuss how this new genre is affecting society, particularly our juries out there, and audience perception. In addition to this Netflix series, Making of a Murderer, other aspects that you'll see on television. I want to thank our panelists tonight. I want to thank our OCU students. I hope I get them all. Maggie and Galen, Kimberly, Teresa. Did I miss anybody? Sade, sorry. I apologize. The students have done a fantastic job. They worked really hard. But I learned one thing tonight: don't kid them about finals. Okay, this is not a good time. So, other than that, let's go ahead and get the presentation started, and thank you all so much for being here.
Hi everyone, so I'm Galen Toll.
I'm Maggie Lanier.
And we are 3Ls at OCU. And kind of like Mark was saying, the history of legal media is sort of in the scripted drama that we all know of famous movies like To Kill a Mockingbird. But now things are shifting to a more reality-based investigative journalism. And that's taken multiple forms, not only TV, watching series or miniseries or documentary features, it's also on the audio side, podcasting. And when we talked about this, that's kind of sort of where right now in recent memory, the trend has started to change. And many of you may know of the series Serial, that was a podcast that was released in the fall and winter of 2014, which is sort of a long-form audio storytelling technique that was told week by week for 12 different weeks about a story of a murder of a high school girl named Hae Min Lee in Baltimore, Maryland in 1999. And over the course of the show, the journalist that was heading the show, Sarah Koenig, actually spoke with Adnan Syed, who was convicted of her murder multiple times throughout the series while he was in prison. And sort of there were themes about inadequate representation of counsel throughout his trial and different topics like this. And it was a hit nationwide, and actually they ended up earning a Peabody Award in 2015 for their work on the podcast. And they actually they broke a record and became the very first podcast ever to reach 5 million downloads on iTunes, the fastest. And so that was sort of what started this trend of reality-based investigative journalism. Then last year in 2015, in the spring, HBO released a miniseries called The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, or The Jinx, as a lot of people came to know it. It was a multi-part miniseries about the real estate heir in New York City, Robert Durst, and the disappearance of his wife in 1982, the death of one of his close friends in 2000, and the death of one of his roommates in Galveston, Texas in 2001. And it was sort of about a guy on the flip side of Serial who was never convicted and never spent any time in prison for any of those disappearances or murders, but the series brought to light the possibility that maybe he actually was behind it. The end of that show had a shocking reveal that sort of took the nation by storm, and that show ended up winning 2 Primetime Creative Arts Awards, Emmy Awards, as well as an award from the Television Critics Association and the Producers Guild of America. And so these are two really big shows in the last couple of years that have started this trend of reality-based investigative journalism, ultimately ending in where we're at right now, Making a Murderer on Netflix.
So, like Mark and Galen have been saying, a lot of our focus for today is on Making a Murderer. In case you haven't seen it, it's a 10-part series on Netflix that took about 10 years to make. Two graduate film students from Columbia University heard about this case in Wisconsin. A man named Stephen Avery was convicted in, I think it was about, I can remember, when he was in 1985 for sexual assault, and it ended up being that he was found innocent, or he was exonerated after DNA evidence in conjunction with help from the Wisconsin Innocence Project discovered that he had not actually done it. And as a result of his exoneration, he ended up suing the Wisconsin, or one of the county he was convicted in, for $36 million. And then in 2005, he and his nephew were arrested for the murder of Teresa Halbach. And the Netflix series really chronicles the trial and highlights some of the flaws that are in the criminal justice system. There's been a lot of backlash recently with the series, and that maybe it was a little more one-sided than originally thought. The series has lots of clips from the actual trial, so it can have the appearance of really showing a fair and unbiased, I guess, representation of the trial, but as news sources have come out saying that there are actually parts of the trial that we haven't seen, and evidence that the Netflix series did not produce or in the show. So it's kind of coming to light that maybe the reality-based TV isn't so realistic. So that's kind of what we are going to talk about today.
Yep, thank you.
I'm Teresa Green, and we're going to quickly introduce our speakers so we can move right into the program. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator tonight, Professor Art LaFrancois, and he's a professor at OCU Law, where he teaches criminal law and criminal procedure. Our first speaker is David Prater. He represents the prosecutor. We have prosecutor, we also have criminal defense attorney that will be talking. He spent 19 years as deputy sheriff of Cleveland County, went on to get his law degree, and then spent 8 years as the Oklahoma County assistant DA, and is currently the Oklahoma County DA. Our next speaker represents an officer. He spent 24 years with the Oklahoma City Police Department in the trenches, as I like to say. Jay Barnett is currently a 3L law student at OCU Law, where I had the privilege of working with him at Judge Bacharach's office.
I'm Kimberly Whitty. Mr. Nolan Clay is our next speaker. He has been a staff writer for the Oklahoman since 1985. He has received several different awards for journalism, and his most recent work includes Revelations that led to the resignation of a State House Speaker and the firing of Tulsa University's athletic director. And next we have Mr. Mac Martin, who has specialized in criminal defense with the emphasis on grand jury, trial, and appellate practice for the last 35 years.
Let me just say by quick way of introduction, I don't know how many of you have availed yourselves of this opportunity, but Mark Brown has a terrific theater room at his home where with some regularity he shows, I know Justice Courage has been there, he shows the old movies that he's talking about. So consider this an invitation to go to his place. So I just wanted to quickly mention one thing. I learned today that if you come from the law school, our new law school, Ethan Harvey, to this building, but if you wrongly get the Devon building in between you, the Devon building takes a long time to circumnavigate in a wind that's like 90 miles an hour, so don't do that. I almost didn't come at all. I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Nolan, it was especially kind of you to come all this way, and we appreciate that. So, I thought maybe we would start with you. One of the students wanted to know, I've got a number of questions that the students have provided me, and one of those questions is, if you could, and I didn't give you a heads up about this, give us a kind of quick, general, if you can, orientation toward, I know it's a big topic, journalistic ethics, since I think behind what we're talking about tonight, we're not going to be terribly specific. Our panel is not about making a murderer and that sort of thing. But if you have a documentary that is based in part on sort of an actual case, whatever, when you're writing about actual cases that are, what sorts of constraints do you feel? What are your professional duties?
Well, you know, I try to get both sides. And you don't get caught up, if you've experienced in that, I mean, a lot of trials aren't where there's whodunit. It's whether the crime has been correctly charged, or in a lot of cases, what the appropriate punishment was, or is going to be. So you don't get all caught up in the strict rules about, you gotta say somebody's accused of something. Jerome Ersland, the pharmacist, I mean, we all saw him shoot. I mean, the question was whether it was murder one, manslaughter, or self-defense. So you don't get all caught up in writing a certain way like you would expect it to be. I mean, sometimes if a reporter's gonna approach you, or a lawyer, it's gonna be, like I said, not a whodunit. Now, ethics-wise, you try to get both sides. Even on the smallest deal, I mentor a young court reporter who's more than half my age. And the other day, he's in a real small store, and I go, did you, about some teacher or former teacher accused of something? I go, did you call the former teacher to see what they might say about this charge that they were molesting a student? He goes, no, it's just a brief. And I go, no, you've got to call every damn time. I said a little stronger than that. But I mean, getting both sides is always important. Now, sometimes I screwed up the other day. They dismissed the charge, the AG's office, against a guy in the American Legion because they didn't have the evidence, and I didn't call his defense attorney who let me know about it the next day. But that's one big thing. The other thing is on murder cases. I've covered a lot of murder cases. You want to, and my wife says I don't do this well. She says that pretty frequently. That you want to give an idea how horrible it is, but you don't want to gross out the readers so much that they're going to turn away from the story. The worst example was the doctor that Mr. Martin represented, who had some mental problems, and he killed his young son. It was horrible, and he wanted to describe it well enough that that people can understand how horrible and how messed up the man must have been, but at the same time not just gross your readers out. There's another case recently. The labor commissioner was murdered. He was murdered by his son. Again, it's not a whodunit. Hell, the man, he was caught there. It's on video. I mean, he's caught right there. And I had the opportunity to be leaked to me some of his mental health records. And I wrote that up. Of course, I made the mistake of saying, not really a mistake, but if I would have caused myself a lot less grief if I hadn't mentioned over and over that there were confidential mental health records. Because the next day I had everybody and their dog calling me saying you violated HIPAA, which I didn't. But you shouldn't have reported this young man's mental health history. Shame on you, you should be fired. Well, I should have, because I want people to understand. And whoever leaked it to me, want people to understand that this young man really is messed up. Now, whether he's not guilty by reason of insanity, because he kind of knew what he was doing, but the whole issue of mental health is important in this state right now, and so.
Thanks, Nolan.
One other epic thing is I get told all the time, please don't put my name in the paper. Please don't put my name in the paper.
I think I've asked you that more than once.
And rape defendants, we don't, because there's a policy. But there was a woman the other day, a widow, who was cheated out of $1 million because she got caught up on some online dating scam where some guy posed as some financial advisor, and she begged me in tears not to embarrass her in the paper. But she also said this, that one of the reasons she didn't want to be embarrassed was because she had all these investors, that she had some kind of company where you invest in oil wells, all these influential people who invested with her in these oil wells. And I thought to myself, well, they're my readers too. I have a duty to say who this woman was, and so that they might decide that they maybe don't want to invest with her anymore because she was foolish enough to follow this scam. She didn't invest any of their money, she gave her own money, but I usually don't withhold names, so don't ask me.
Mac Martin said that I might have to slap him to wake him up during the program this evening, so I'm going to do that, at least metaphorically. Mac, have you noted, are there things that you do differently in your practice because of what people have come to expect by way of, say, documentaries, film, television portrayals of lawyers? Kind of two questions. What changes have you noticed in portrayals of lawyers? And if it's the case, is there anything that you do differently because of what you think, for example, the jury is expecting you to do? Something that they might have read about or seen?
I wouldn't say I necessarily change my presentation because of what I expect the jury is expecting from us, but over time, over the last, unfortunately, 30 plus years of practicing law, the practice of law has changed. When I first started practicing, we were lucky if we had fingerprints. Now we're lucky if we don't have DNA. And so technology has changed so much. Our presentation and our case and how we present ourselves is necessarily changed. In virtually every case now, you have expert witnesses or some form of an expert or some type of technical information is going to come out. When I first started practicing law back in the late 70s, there wasn't even any rules relating to providing exchange of discovery documents between the prosecution and the defense, other than the prosecution was supposed to give us exculpatory evidence. We didn't have to give them a list of who our witnesses were. We didn't have to tell them anything. We could just go in there and here's our defense. I mean, it was pretty much, cowboy, shoot from the hip. So that kind of change has occurred, but because of what people come to expect by watching TV, I don't really change my presentation because of that. Most of the law and order shows and law shows I don't watch anyway. I don't get enough of that work, okay?
Jay, what about from a police perspective? You could ask a similar question about techniques for gathering evidence, the sort of evidence that one gathers, the safety with which one does it. Does one videotape the evidence gathering process? Any changes that you've seen in terms of police practice, either predicated on or affected by dramatic or documentary portrayals of trials?
Affected that last qualifier changes things. I don't know that does. Certainly, I think everyone in this room has heard of the CSI effect, and that's real. But yeah, I mean, when I first came on in '90, officers didn't even lift their own fingerprints. Now you have officers equipped to not only lift their own prints, but to look for, identify DNA. Economies of scale have brought the cost of DNA down. I used to spend a ton of time explaining to someone who was a victim of an auto burglary why we didn't lift DNA. And I'm thinking, well, you lost $75 for the stuff, and it costs us almost $1,000 to try to identify and match DNA. And now that, or at least when I left, that test was down to around $125 a shot. And officers were carrying those kits, and in fact, they had actually hired non-commissioned, non-officers to go out to property theft scenes and after the fact, still connected by radio but not armed, just to do that, to take some of the load off of the officers. So that's a dramatic change. That used to be something completely reserved for our big crime scene trucks. And by the way, I initially got my first, I was in there, my first lecture about the emerging science of DNA in the Academy in 1990 from Joyce Gilchrist.
Who? Well, that's kind of an interesting segue. So I did want to ask Mr. Prater about the sort of the CSI effect, expectations that your office has, expectations that maybe juries have, maybe even individual defendants, but anything along those lines in terms of how what you do might have changed over time or what your expectations might be.
You know, I think the television shows, the movies, all of those that depict legal drama. You know, I'm like Mac. I don't watch it. I find myself screaming at the TV. I get so angry. My wife, you know, has to send me to my room. But I think if there's anything that it's done, you know, and Jay talked about the CSI effect, it forces prosecutors, young prosecutors particularly, to not skip steps, to not be lazy, to fully present every piece of evidence that they have, and then explain why, when you have a technical investigator on the stand, you know, were you able to find any DNA on the swabs that you took? No. Would you tell the jury why you did not? You know, not that you did find it and who, you know, what astronomical number is going to tell you that that guy over there did it, but why you did not. Because many times we know that lay people, jurors, even lawyers expect DNA. If you walked up and touched this pole right here, most people in the room are going to say, well, if a TI came, a technical investigator came up and swabbed this pole, it's going to say David Prater was here and he touched this pole. Well, that's just not true. I can rub all over this pole, and maybe not, you're going to find DNA. You may be able to extract DNA from the swab that they take off this pole. And so we have to explain that. But I think it keeps lawyers from being lazy. And it also requires, you know, a lot of times, I think if you have a mental defect, that's the only time that most lawyers that I know really enjoy voir dire. All right, I hate voir dire. I hate it because it's the part of the of the trial that I can't control. Everything else in that courtroom, I'm in control of to some extent. Okay, I know what the defense is going to present because they provided me their witness list for the most part, hopefully. And I've talked to those witnesses, or at least I've seen reports or a summary of what they're going to testify to. You know, I know how the judge is going to act. I've tried cases in front of that judge before. I know what they're going to limit me, you know, from doing or allow me to do or whatever like that. But voir dire, you can never control. And you know, you get some of the craziest things go on and come from that jury box sometimes. But what it does require us to do is we have a realization that all this information is out there. This making of a murder crap. And it's crap. Mm-hmm. You know, when you tell half of the story, that's not a good documentary. All right? The guy may be innocent. I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. But tell the whole damn story, okay? So anyway, we know that stuff's out there.
Would you please stay on topic?
I can't stay on topic. You know me. Okay, I'm sorry. But what it does, what we do know is that all that information is out there, and it forces people like me who do not like voir dire to engage in conversation with those potential jurors more than I might otherwise. What do you think about the legal system, Mr. Holmesy? Do you have any impressions of the legal system? What evidence might you expect? You've heard the judge tell you this is a murder trial. What evidence might you expect? Do you believe that you're going to find DNA in every case? Will you listen to the experts tell you why you may not find DNA in every case, including a murder? You know, and so you really kind of get good feeling, well, you know, Ms. Burton, do you agree with Mr. Holmesy or not? Tell me what you feel about it. So you really start to work down the panel, you know, and it forces us really to do things that I should have done all along. And that is really engage with the jury in a good conversation about what they know, what they don't know, and what they feel about what we're doing.
Nolan, the whole thing was on topic.
Okay.
Nolan, would you not report in the paper that the Oklahoma County District Attorney said I could rub all over that pole and they said I do not think people would understand. I I do not even know what to ask him. I was kidding about keeping you on topic because you were completely on topic because you were talking about, and I was going to ask a question about that, which you've already answered. From your perspective, clearly, Making a Murderer is not a good example of the sort of documentary art that could help people understand trials and forensics and even ultimate things like guilt and innocence. I'm just wondering if you have, and the answer may be no, if you're familiar with a documentary that for you lays out in a fairer way, in a more representative way, in an educative way, a case.
You know, I can't think of one just off the top of my head right now, but I will tell you this. That gentleman does appear to be, you know, truly innocent and have truly been exonerated of the rape that he had been convicted of. You want to talk about exonerations, let's truly talk about exonerations. Look at Jeffrey Todd Pierce here in Oklahoma. Look at Mr. Cotton, I believe, out of Tennessee. You know, eyewitness identification of the man who was on top of this woman who was raping. So those cases are there. There are innocent people who've been convicted in this country. I'm not saying there isn't, but let's be truthful about who is and who isn't and what the evidence truly is. Not walk in with this some crazy bias, trying to make the police look bad, the prosecutors look crazy, you know, the defense lawyer looking like a hero, or vice versa. There are a lot of times where they try to make the defense lawyer looking like an idiot, because my God, anyone could have defended this guy. Look how innocent he was, but this bozo walked in there thinking he was going to be a great lawyer, and he screwed everything up. It's completely unfair to everyone.
So let's use that observation as sort of a springboard for another question. Anybody who wants to jump in, jump in. Are there clear problems and pervasive problems with the criminal justice system that the sorts of documentaries and even kind of narrative storytelling films we're talking about get in the way of? The disguise, mask. Does a documentary like Jinx, just for example, indicate that there's a problem that there really isn't in the criminal justice system, but the problem we really have is X, and that's not interesting enough for a documentary or a movie, just anybody who has.
Or there's a documentary that came out on ESPN about a week ago, and you can go on demand and you can see it. It's called Fantastic Lives. It's 30 or something. And it was about the Duke lacrosse team, and 10 years ago. And I hadn't followed it that closely, but I just happened to be watching TV and I saw it. And when you see it, you are absolutely in awe, because you think these guys, the way it was portrayed was that these guys are just, you know, very wealthy young kids.
They're Duke
lacrosse players, and they can get away with anything. And there are rallies against them, you know, everybody comes out against them, the media, all the media's against them. Nolan would never have been there, but the district attorney ultimately got disbarred and ended up being held in contempt and did a day in the county jail. But, you know, in the end, it was a great documentary about how the system can go wrong. And it did go wrong in that case, and ultimately, in the end of it, you know, the Attorney General for the state of North Carolina comes out and says, you know, these guys are innocent. And it was all, I mean, it's a good example of how things can go bad when people don't dot their I's, cross their T's, and they're not looking at the long-term goal. What's the right thing to do?
And that's an additionally complex case because of the intersection of criminal justice system problems and race. So you've got people who are trying, a bunch of white people, sort of finally to be a little bit sensitive to race and that sensitivity. So it's uncomfortable to talk about, for a number of white people anyway, like me, it's uncomfortable to talk about the wrongful accusations against the spoiled, privileged Duke lacrosse players, because you've got this woman of color who probably something bad happened to her, but probably not what she said. So that's a really, I think that's a great example of.
Well, in that case, you know, just by example, the DA came out and said, there's no DNA at all on this lady. And then later on, when the DNA evidence comes forward, it finds that there's 11 different men's DNA on her that was never disclosed to the defense. And then later on, you find out of those 11 different individual DNAs, none of it is anybody on the Duke lacrosse team. And we had a DA run amok in that particular instance. And, you know, these guys were just lucky that they had, I'm not patting defense lawyers on the back, but that they had good lawyers that were taking care of them that, you know, in the documentary is kind of unique. There's a young lawyer who buys a book on Amazon and he learns about DNA and goes through this report and figures out, gee whiz, this isn't quite what we thought it was, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I think the danger, and this isn't necessarily a documentary, but there's a danger of misinformation getting out. I mean, like the People versus O.J. Simpson is very, very popular right now. And there was a scene there from where the Johnny Cochran character is telling O.J. Simpson that O.J., if we get one black juror on there, we get a hung juror, you're going home. You're going home. And I had one of my colleagues the next day go, if there's a hung jury, does the defendant in a murder case go home? And I go, no. No, unless most of them voted for acquittal and there's one or two hung out for guilty, usually it's the other way around and the DA is going to try them again. So it was just complete. I mean, maybe that happened. Maybe Johnny Cochran did say that, but it's not true.
You know, I think the overarching issue here that strikes me is that, you know, we have a society at this point that would rather be entertained than informed. And so media cannot help but respond to that to some degree. They have to keep the lights on. I'm not saying that the Oklahoman does that.
I do sometimes.
Okay, I would say this, I would say it's a strange world where, in a problematic world, where the Oklahoman is competing with less credible sites that are maybe pumping out more exciting information, more polarizing statements that tend to appeal to emotion. But I'm gonna disagree very slightly. I think, you know, the other day I was looking at a Facebook page. It's all old cops, and it's, you know, private page. You can't be there unless you're, you know, somebody invited me, and so I'm a member. One of the questions was, what was the show that drove you to be a police officer? And for me, it was Adam 12, right? And so that comes from an era where really, we didn't really question the police that much, right? I mean, those guys were great. I mean, who doubts them? And so now we've evolved, it seems like, maybe at least significant piece of that is the Grisham book that then propels a different look at police work and maybe a more critical view of the police. And I'm gonna say that, you know, it was about 2010, 2011 when I was doing post-grad work looking at that we had in Oklahoma City, and I'm not gonna name officers, I'm not gonna embarrass anyone, but you know, we had an officer from when it was pretty legendary on the Oklahoma City Police Department take the stand for the defense and say, I don't care what the DNA says, I don't care what the fingerprints say. That registered sex offender that you can place at that homicide scene here in Oklahoma City back in 1988, 89, he didn't do it. I got a confession from the guy that did it, her boyfriend, back in 1988. And I know one of the detectives involved in that. I know the heat that he took for stepping up and saying this is a bad case. And I say all that to say this, cops are great people. I do not hear, I love these, I'm serious, and I mean this. There's nothing in the world like when you're doing the right, you think you're doing the right, you're out there trying to enforce the law and do justice, and you're in trouble, okay, and those gray shirts come busting through the door to save you, okay, and I'm talking about the officer you call for backup. These are good people. They rush in to incredibly difficult situations, and I think it takes a moral certainty to do that. And I think we celebrate that and we admire that, and we should, but we should be careful of that, because that moral certainty can lead to a certainty that we're always right, and a certainty that we know what happened before we really know what happened. And we need a public that certainly respects law enforcement, but is willing to scrutinize them and is willing to look at their work and consider their testimony with critical ears.
What I will say, and this is a little bit related to what Nolan said, I'll expand it a little bit more. There's a great injustice that's done every night on the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news. Nolan Clay has a good opportunity to get both sides of the story. He's given the space on the paper to write both sides of the story. He does a really good job of that. He's a personal friend as well, and I respect him professionally very much. But the great injustice is this: the 4, 5, 9, and 25 channels that you go and religiously watch in the afternoon, you get 1 minute and 30 seconds of a story to have a very inexperienced, probably about 24 or 25-year-old reporter try to tell you about a very complex issue. It may not be always a law case, a criminal case, or whatever. Maybe about whatever. But people take that as gospel because it's Channel 4, it's Channel 9, it's Channel 5. First of all, you've got to understand that young reporter didn't know anything about that issue when they started that day. They went into their 9 o'clock reporters meeting, and some AP, associate producer, who was 2 years younger than them, said, "Hey, there's something really cool going on. Go down the street and talk to David Prager about what's going on in the courthouse today." They walk in and they want to talk to me, and I'll say, "How long you got?" "Well, I've got 5 minutes because I got to go talk to the judge, or I've got to go talk to the defense lawyer, or whatever." And so many times I'll say, "Well, I'm not going to talk to you." But what's sad is I'll go home and I'll watch the story, and it is completely opposite of what the truth was regarding that issue. And so where print media has the luxury, I'll call it, to do the right thing, and the ability with reporters like Nolan and others in this newsroom to do the right thing and tell the story, the media that we pay the most attention to because it's sexy and it has pictures, they suck at telling the truth. Suck at telling the truth. And it's just the truth. And so jurors come in, they think they know about my case already because they've heard for the last several months about this defendant and how the crime happened or whatever like that. We have to completely flush their minds of all the garbage that they've been consuming for however many months. And so that is an injustice. It's sad. It breaks my heart because my wife's been in the news business. She got out of it for the same reason I just told you about. They wouldn't let her do long format pieces and tell the whole story. You tell about someone's life in 1 minute and 30 seconds, you just can't do it.
And the part of that you would play, apart from not having time to sort of do the educational thing, is you would be quoted for 4.5 seconds saying something that's like crazily inappropriate given the 4 words that they chose. That's a different.
They would get this quote: "Everyone knows Nolan Clay's guilty," and the part they would take off would be, "But I know the evidence shows he's not. We got the right guy." And so what they would hear on the news that night is David Prager saying, "Everyone knows Nolan Clay's guilty." You know, Linda Kavanaugh with all of her uplighting and make her look younger and all that stuff. Did you hear what the DA just said?
I did when I first moved to Oklahoma City, I did a story. It was on, it doesn't matter, it was on one of the local channels on the news. They wanted my views about a new obscenity ruling. So there was me, they did this in front of my house, there I am, my house in the background. And they would cut away from that to like some cheesy porno newsstand thing with all the good bits like blacked out and stuff. And it was like super awful to be there and have like Mr. Porno King. It was not a good look. So I think media has a lot to do that it can do better, whether that media is sort of current and modern, whether it's documentary or whether, again, it's kind of...
Well, we'll say one thing as well. Let me say something quick. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean to take up all the time. There are reporters like Adriana Basinski that I don't always get along with, but I'll tell you, she has invested herself and her career into learning what we do in the courthouse. And so, you know, you compare her to someone who just got out of journalism school, and the stories hardly, they can do the same story, they hardly even look the same. So there are good people at the news stations and electronic media and on radio doing a good job. But it's those that have been there a long time. But they don't last long in this market.
It's Linda Cavanaugh that you have something against from what I understand. Before we run out of time, let me make sure, does anybody have questions? Any questions at all? We're going to, I think, be out at 7 o'clock, is that right?
I'd like to know their opinion on whether they think trials should be televised. And should the public see the trials the way they do in Florida? Yes.
I've been in a televised trial. I tried a case in Fargo, North Dakota, and they have a rule there that they can televise a trial, and the cameras are on you all the time, and they don't run it all day long, but at the end of the day, there's recaps of the trial, and I just from a personal standpoint, I didn't like it. They have one camera in the room that feeds on you, and all the stations get it. It made you self-conscious. It made you self-conscious as to what do I look like? Am I doing this appropriately? And after a while, you learn that it's not there and you ignore it. But I just didn't feel good about it because I didn't like the way it made me feel. Like I said, it was about a 2-week trial, so you had to get over it. But you know, at the end of the day, when the news is running and they're showing excerpts from the trial, they're showing something that probably had zero significance at all in the whole trial, but they made it out to be something big. Today in courts, Mac Martin asked a stupid question, and you know, they showed a stupid question. There was a bunch of those stupid questions, but I mean, you know, it would be something like that. And I'm just very much against televised trials.
Well, Judge, the bottom line is it doesn't really matter in Oklahoma because one judge tried to make the preliminary hearing of Terry Nichols televised when both the prosecutors and defense didn't want to, and the appellate court says unless the defendant agrees in a criminal case, it's not going to be televised. And that changes when the sentencing happens or the verdict's read.
So his host call was always
And that's exactly what I was coming to. Now, when host call, everybody was interested in that, and the fact that it was televised when the verdict was read brought everybody who couldn't get into that courtroom, and it was packed, allowed everybody who was interested in that case to see it. So there is some that's one advantage of having stuff televised. But to the trial proceedings, unless the defendant agrees, it's not going to happen in Oklahoma. So.
I worry about the protection of witnesses, the judge. You know, in this day and age, we have enough intimidation of our witnesses, including actual violence, not just threats of violence against them. And so I am concerned about protecting our witnesses and them being reluctant, if they have a television camera on them, to speak freely and openly and tell everything they know about what they're being asked about, knowing that it's going to go out to that defendant's family, and that defendant's family may be waiting in their driveway when they get home. I have a great deal of concern about that.
And you think it's more of an intimidation than to have no one in there writing about it?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. I do.
Now, the bombing case, the federal case, of course, was televised because lots of people here were affected and couldn't get to Denver, and so it was televised for the victims. The camera, you didn't even know it was there. It was in a recess, and I don't think in that instance the witnesses were bothered by being on camera. They weren't even aware of it most of the time. So there are instances where televising a big case is important because not everybody can be in the court.
And remind me, on the bombing case, was it televised for television viewing, or was it a live feed to a subject?
It was a closed circuit feed to the victims of the bombing, and it was shown at the FAA Center to just victims.
I think it affects the behavior of the lawyers too. You know,
Well, and I think Judge Ito is an example of in that OJ case, it affects the judge also.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Is there anything we could do as lawyers to, you know, we don't have exactly the best view in the media. Is there anything you think we could do to help improve what people think of the profession and what our job really is?
Don't talk to the media.
That
would help a lot.
Yeah, I call Mac, and he always says, it's just a terrible misunderstanding. Every damn time.
why you don't ever want, well, you've got a case pending, why you would never want to talk to the media before that case is closed?
I've got nothing to lose, nothing to gain and everything to lose by talking to the media. And Nolan knows that, and he calls me and he tries to talk to me, but I don't like talking about my cases because, you know, there's nothing, if he talks to me, he's gonna pick up the phone and call David and say, hey, David, Max said X, Y, Z, what do you think? And David's gonna say A, B, C, not X, Y, Z. And next thing you know, we're in a fight in the media. As I tell Nolan, I've tried a lot of cases in the courtroom and I've won a couple of them, but I've never won one in the paper.
I think lawyers just don't try to misdirect us. Just be upfront and just say if you can't talk to us, just say you can't talk to us and say why.
But people will call and say, can we talk to your client? No, of course not. You shouldn't even try to ask them.
No, you should. I mean, I try to ask clients, but Mitch Solomon hates me right now because I wrote his little kid who killed his family, and the kid said he wanted the death penalty. Now, Mitch apparently talked him out of it because he got life sentences without parole just the other day. But I mean, there are certain instances where you're going to want to write the defendant or try to talk to him regardless.
He wrote you a letter, didn't he?
He did.
Well, you represent not just yourself, but a profession, all right? And it is a profession I'm proud to be a member of. And I get really angry when people make lawyer jokes and talk down on us and are serious about it. But the truth is, a lot of that is deserved, because there are a lot of clowns we practice with every day in the courthouse that don't deserve to be lawyers, all right? But you can always operate the way that you know you're supposed to operate. With have your good moral standards, with your character, always do the right thing for the right reason, don't lie to people, treat your clients right, you know, those you represent, do it the right way. You know, you want to boost up how people feel about lawyers. You always do the right thing for the right reason and treat people the right way. That helps, it really does. And also, I'll say this, if there are lawyers around you that aren't operating the way they should and aren't practicing the way they should, report them to the bar and don't be afraid to do it. Too many lawyers sitting in this room and in my office and in other places, so I'll include us as well, let people get away with stuff and don't ever report it to the bar. And then we complain because people get all up, you know, people complain because everyone looks down on our profession when we knew that that person they're complaining about had been doing that for 5 years and 10 years earlier. So the way you operate matters, and the way we police ourselves, just like the police department has to do, the way we police ourselves as lawyers in this profession matters. That's how you take care of our profession and uphold and bolster our credibility and the way people look at us.
Does anybody have a question that will top that? So if I'm not mistaken, I think that is it, right?
Yes. We want to just thank our panelists once again and thank our moderator.